The next one is a monopolistically competitive graph. So in monopolistic competition, you do have something that looks like this, where it is basically just our monopoly graph. Okay, so here's my dark line. Here is my marginal revenue line. Here is my marginal cost line. And in monopolistic competition, the one thing that's different is in the long run, we can have people come in and out. So remember, long run, people can enter and exit, right? To get us to a long run. In Monopoly, it just is. So because people can enter and exit, you have to go to where MR equals MC. So you still go MR equals MC for profit max, right? You'd still want to do that. But when you come up here and get your price, and it's always good to draw in this one, your ATC last, because your average total cost curve is going to come down, touch right there, keep coming down, hit your marginal cost curve, and then come up, right? So there's my ATC, and this is now long run normal. So you can have long run normal profit in a monopolistically competitive firm. Every other question about monopoly applies. So they can ask you, is it on an inelastic or elastic portion? Is it productively or allocatively efficient? They can ask you every single thing that you had on a monopoly question, except this time you just have to know that in the long run, if you were experiencing profit, all that happens is when people come in, your demanders, right? That's the big deal. Your demanders are going to leave. They're going to start being separated amongst other people. And because of that, your demander is going to shift to the left and you're going to end up on the downslope of your ATC. We don't regulate this one because if we were to regulate it, then all of a sudden you'd start losing some people and that kind of stuff. And we don't want to regulate a monopolistically competitive firm because we like monopolistic competitive firms. We like having choices. So monopolistic competition in the books. If we do go back to Monopoly just for a second, as I'm looking at that, we could regulate this monopoly. And I guess I didn't really talk about that when we're doing it. So if you were to regulate this monopoly, we could regulate it to a couple different places. We could regulate it to try just to get to our allocatively efficient point, right? So we could say, oh, let's regulate this thing and then regulate it to here coming across. We could do that, right? We could regulate it to, I'm trying to find a different color here. We could regulate it to here coming across. We could also regulate it to the bottom of our average total cost curve to regulate them to a normal profit. So when you regulate these things, depending, you might regulate it here and then there'd still be a little profit. You might regulate it down here to normal profit. So you can do different stuff if you want to regulate. Usually the regulation ones will come if it's a natural monopoly. That one we can do in a second. So we could regulate that. That is true. Your last curves coming up here, one of them could be a labor curve, right? So now switch from firms into, this is now the labor market, and this is now the firm who's hiring in the labor market. Your labor, so this is like, well, this could be any factor, I guess, factor markets. They were going to give you like a wage, right? So it doesn't matter if they give you a wage or if they were giving you something like rent would be the other one. So factor markets, remember, labeling changes to wage or rent. When that happens, you still have a supply and demand, but now in my firm side, I have a downward sloping value my marginal product of labor because I'm using labor here. So I put a little L there. My wage rate is going to be here at wage one, and I'm going to produce where that wage is equal to the number of the value of my worker. Things can move those around, like if all of a sudden your workers become more productive, that could happen, and then you'd move your demand curve and your value of your marginal product of labor curve. or a new technology happens where you could move your value of your marginal labor curve in the demand curve because you're more productive. Lowering the wages could do the same thing, but moving on the line versus the whole line. So lowering wages would move you more. But again, this is my supply of labor coming across as perfectly horizontal in a perfect competitive factor market. Now, you could get something like a monopsony graph in this. And if that's the case, remember, you've hired up all the labor. So a monopsony graph is going to be a little bit odd. A monopsony graph would have your supply of labor upward sloping, but then they would also have your marginal factor cost of labor as a upward sloping line above my supply of labor. So why is a monopsony like that? Monopsony. Why? Because you've hired up all the labor already, so the marginal factor cost is higher than your supply of labor. So when you have a downward sloping value of your marginal product of labor curve, or sometimes they'll use your marginal revenue product of labor, they might see that one in there, you're still going to go to where those two things equal each other. This one sometimes you'll see also marginal resource cost, but if this is labor, you'd see wage, quantity of workers. You're still going to go to where your value of your marginal product and your marginal factor cost equal each other. You're going to come down. That's the quantity of labor you're going to hire. The difference is, in this case, the supply of labor is what gives us the wage. So you're going to hire this quantity, but you're only going to pay them this wage. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll ask different questions on minimum wage stuff and whatnot. Just remember, as you start going up, you still have a supply and basically a demand for labor here. And as you start putting in different things, like let's say some kind of a minimum wage higher than what this wage is, if you put it in down like here to do this wage turns out this is going to dominate now. If this was going to be a wage that would be a minimum wage, for example, higher, you would go to where like you would want maybe to demand this much labor, but the supply would only be here. So you would end up with a shortage of workers here, because at this wage you would actually demand more of them. But the people wouldn't necessarily work. This factor cost line goes away because it becomes horizontal right here, because your factor cost before it was more expensive, right? You'd have to hire and pay workers more money, etc., to get them to work. Now there's a minimum wage, so you don't have to pay them any more to work. It's just $8, $8, $8, $8, $8, $8, $8, $8. For this guy, it was like, here was $6, but it actually cost you $15. And at $7, it cost you like $16 or $18 or more expensive, because you'd have to pay everybody else a wage increase as well. As you look at this one, just remember, this is like a kinked labor supply curve here, okay? And all that's telling us is if I was to hire one more worker, what's going to happen? I'm going to be up here on this portion of the line. So if I were to hire one more, that's great, but it's going to cost me way up here. They like to do these, especially throwing like minimum wages in there. That's, you could throw a minimum wage up here as well. That's fine. But now all of a sudden you're going to have a whole bunch of people wanting to work, right? So my supply of labor is going to be greater than what the demand for labor is. And up here, I'm going to have a surplus of workers, lots of unemployed, because the wages is too high. That would be a monopsony graph. You might get that one too. Your last graph for econ, for micro anyway, is going to be externalities. So again, an externality. Now we're back to just regular old supply and demand. So I just have price and quantity, and I have supply and demand of this particular good. So these are externality graphs. Okay. If I have a negative externality, it means I'm producing something that is causing a problem. So in these cases, we're usually looking at your marginal social benefit, and this is my marginal private cost. And then I'm going to have a negative externality in this case. So this is a negative. My marginal social cost is higher. That's weird. My market price here should be PM. My quantity would be QM, but that's not what society wants. Society is actually angry that I'm doing this. So up here is my deadweight loss. And my society wants QS and PS. So we want less of this thing. So the deadweight loss is actually greater on this side. The problem, or the way to fix it, I should say, not a problem, is to tax it. So tax it this distance. So tax it per unit, not lump sum, right? Tax it this distance. What's going to happen? It becomes a tax problem. So now here is my taxes. So there's my tax. Here's my area that normally in a tax problem would be a deadweight loss. It is not. We actually correct the deadweight loss. The deadweight loss goes away. And then this would be tax revenue. They like to ask questions about consumer and producer surplus here. We didn't go over that graph, but here would be my new consumer surplus. Here would be my new producer surplus. And again, no deadweight loss. If you're looking at a positive externality, so in this case, marginal social benefit, this is also my marginal private benefit. So that's kind of weird how they do that. But if they were asking for labeling, these two lines for demand would be the same. And a positive externality for something like vaccine stuff would be a good example, right? A lighthouse, something like that. Remember, in this case, we start with a marginal private benefit, but society wants more of it. Now we have demand and a marginal social benefit out here, right? We're demanding more of that thing. This becomes my marginal social cost. This is where we are, right? So here's my private, like my market situation. And there's a deadweight loss too, right? The deadweight loss in this case is up here because society wants more of this particular thing. So we should go out to where the society meets society. And in this case, we should be at quantity S, PS. The problem is society does not want to pay, right? The more people that get it, like they don't want to pay this amount. They only want to pay this amount. So you should subsidize this. So here is the subsidy to get us out to this price. And that subsidy is your tax dollars at work to make everything kind of go here. Just recall, again, your deadweight loss going away, even though that seems odd because it's up here, but that subsidy helps. Always per unit subsidize a positive externality. Always per unit tax a negative externality. That would be every graph you need to know that I can think of that you might be tested on. Everything from your production possibility curves all the way through your last unit on externalities. Hopefully that's a good review. Feel free to pause it as you go through, but that would be all of them. Good luck.